Hey everyone, Heero here, and today we're gonna look at Yixuan, ZZZ's first Rupture class agent who relies on spamming defense ignoring combos and EX specials to deal big PP damage. I'll be discussing her kit, builds, engines, and possible teams. Just as a quick disclaimer though, the footage and information that will be shown is from the creator experience server, so things can still change when her banner drops. Let's start by discussing what the Rupture class is, since it's a brand new class with new mechanics after all. Rupture class agents relies on a new damage type called sheer damage, which completely ignores enemy defenses, meaning pen ratio or defense shreds are completely useless for these agents. Now, they also scale off a completely new stat called sheer force, but there are no sheer force substats. So normally, the only way to increase it is by investing in attack, since Rupture agents converts 30% of their attack into sheer force. So for example, if you have 100 attack, you get 30 sheer force. However, Yixuan is a bit unique, since she also converts her total HP into sheer force thanks to her core passive, with her getting 0.1 sheer force for every point of HP, which translates to a 10% conversion. Rupture Agents also has a unique energy system called Adrenaline. This is similar to an agent's energy bar where it's used to launch EX specials. However, there is a big difference. Unlike normal energy, Adrenaline has faster in-combat passive regen, with Rupture Agents gaining 2 adrenaline per second compared to normal agents which only gain 1.2 energy per second without considering ER main stats of course. But thanks to this unique energy system, it allows for Rupture Agents to spam their EX specials or abilities much more often compared to other classes. Yixuan also has the unique type called Auric Ink, which is basically just the ether element with a unique anomaly meter. It still triggers corruption and benefits from ether-related buffs and reassurance. However, what makes it unique is her core passive. It makes it so that all Auric Ink damage is considered as sheer damage, so they ignore defense and use her sheer force as its main damage multiplier. But speaking of which, let's talk about her core passive, starting with its buffs. Aside from her HP to sheer force conversion buffing her damage, her core passive also provides a 60% unconditional damage buff to the 6 abilities shown in screen. And it also provides several adrenaline-related benefits. First of all, it automatically fills her adrenaline bar at the start of combat. Second, upon triggering corruption with Auric Ink, it provides 10 adrenaline with a 10-second cooldown. And lastly, every perfect dodge will give her 5 adrenaline with a 1-second cooldown. Her core passive also gives her access to technique points, with every 1 point of adrenaline consumed giving 0.67 technique points. Now, these technique points are required to launch one of her 2 ultimates. That's right, she has 2 ultimates. Mechanically, they're both very similar though. They both deal high Auric Ink damage and evenly redistributes all allies' HP. But her ultimates do have a few differences. First of all, Qingming Sky Shade requires decibels to activate, is stronger than her technique point ult, and has a cooler and longer animation. While her Endless Talisman Suppression requires technique points to use, meaning you can use it more often. And it also gives 1 Auric point which allows her to use basic attack Auric Array. Now if you have both max decibels and technique points, Endless Talisman Suppression will be used first, which can be followed up by Qingming Sky Shade by pressing Alt again. But moving on, aside from the standard 5-part basic attack combo, she has 2 other unique basic attacks that can be used by holding dodge. Her first one is Auric Array. Like I said earlier, this requires Auric points from her technique point ult to use. But to make up for that, it's a very strong attack that ends with basic attack Qingming Eruption as the finisher, and as a bonus, Yixuan becomes immune during the entire attack. It also continuously recovers adrenaline at the rate of 7 per second for 3 seconds, regenerating up to 21 adrenaline. While her second one is Ink Veil Cloud Coalescence, which is basically a weaker version of Auric Array. And it reduces damage received by 40% while casting it, and it does not require Auric points. But the neat thing about these skills is that they're both swap cancelable, so it's the perfect skill to use before switching to your supports. Now, she also has multiple EX specials, but let's first talk about Cloud Shaper and Ashen Ink Becomes Snow. Now, Cloud Shaper is activated by holding the basic attack button when you have enough adrenaline. It's a high damage attack that consumes adrenaline constantly for 2 seconds, with it finishing with EX special Ashen Ink Becomes Shadows. Now, you do become immune while using this skill, and it can trigger a perfect dodge if timed correctly, allowing you to get 5 extra decibels from her core passive. But moving on to her next 3 EX specials, which takes the form of a 3-part attack, starting with EX Special Ink Manifestation. The first part has you hold or tap the special button to have her charge up, and if she gets hit or she starts to glow, you can let go for an uppercut. But the cool thing is, there are 2 ways to trigger a perfect block with this skill. You can either time the activation of the skill to right before you get hit, or time the uppercut portion of the attack to right before an enemy hits you with a yellow or red flash attack. And either way you do so will grant you 10 adrenaline. Now for the second part, if you manage to trigger a perfect block with Ink Manifestation, or if you charged until she's flashing, you can press the special button again to activate her EX special, Celestial Cloud Blitz Break. Now during this attack's animation, you have 2 options. If you have 1 auric point, you can hold dodge to combo into auric array. But if you have at least 20 adrenaline, you can press the special button again to launch this 3-part skill's final EX special, Qingming Eruption Break. Now this EX special is an extremely high damaging 3-part attack, and it's where a lot of her damage comes from, especially when paired with other abilities. So make sure to spam it a lot since she does build adrenaline super fast. But moving on to her additional ability, which needs a support, stun, or defense character to activate, which is pretty much half of the units in the game. First of all, every time any of her teammates uses an ult, she will constantly regen 2 adrenaline for 10 seconds for a total of 20 adrenaline, which is of course great for spamming lots of EX specials. Now, every time Yixuan switches out with a defensive or evasive assist, she automatically launches a follow-up attack dealing 225% of her sheer force as damage while restoring 5 adrenaline. And lastly, her additional ability grants her several buffs. First of all, it buffs her EX Special Cloud Shaper and Ashen Ink's damage against stunned enemies by 30%. And whenever she uses any one of her ult, she enters the meditation state and gains 40% crit damage for 15 seconds. And it's also worth mentioning, she also has a unique dodge which is perfect for traversing the new combat maps in the Wi-Fi Peninsula. Now, Yixuan is a very combo-centric unit with her 2 ultimates, her fast adrenaline regen, spammable EX specials, and unique basic attacks, all allowing for lots of possible skill combos. And it's this combo-centric nature that makes her a unit that benefits a lot from field time, with more field time allowing her to dish out more combos and damage while allowing for faster adrenaline and technique point buildup, resulting in spamming more ult and EX specials for massive defense ignoring damage. And finally, for ability priority, I recommend leveling her core first, then her ult and skill, then basic attacks, then dodge, and finally assists. Now you pretty much use her entire kit, so I recommend leveling all of her abilities. So rip Denny's, I guess. But with her kit out of the way, let's talk about her Mindscapes. Her M1 at the start of combat gives her 120 technique points and a permanent 10% crit rate buff. And whenever a squad member hits an enemy, she deals an attack equaling to 50% of her sheer force while restoring 5 adrenaline. It's similar to her core passive's additional damage procs, this lets you squeeze in a bit more damage while giving you adrenaline to help with spamming more EX specials. But the neat thing is, it gives her a full technique point bar at the start of battle, allowing her to ult immediately. For her M2, it makes her EX special and ult ignore 15% ease arrest while introducing some benefits to her 2 ultimates. Her Decibel ultimate now extends stuns by 3 seconds, while her technique point ult gives 1 stack of condensed ink. You can then consume this condensed ink by either tapping the basic attack button after basic attack Qingming Eruption and EX Special Ashen Ink, or by tapping the special button at the end of her 3-part EX special. This ends up triggering an EX special called Endless Talisman Suppression Break, dealing 1,200 of her sheer force as damage, while her M4 makes any of her ults give her 1 stack of Tranquility with a max of 2 stacks, with Tranquility buffing her EX special attacks, Cloud Shaper, and Ashen Ink's damage by 30%. This is even more damage for her EX specials, and it stacks nicely with her core passive, allowing it to deal even more damage, especially during stuns. And finally, her M6, her meditation state now also buffs her sheer force damage by 20%, while her Decibel ultimate now grants a stack of regulated breathing. which lets you ignore the technique point cost of ultimate endless talisman suppression once. This allows you to reliably launch both of her ults back to back without having to fill both decibel and technique meter at least every 30 seconds. And it allows for a fun burst damage rotation where you can use 3 ultimates back to back if you fill both the technique point gauge and her decibel meter. And with her Mindscapes out of the way, let's talk about her possible Wenjins. Yixuan's signature gives 30% HP with its main stat and 20% crit rate just by equipping it. And every time she uses an EX special, it gives her a stack of Qingming Companion for 15 seconds, stacking up to 2 times, with repeated triggers refreshing its duration. Now, for each stack of Qingming Companion, it buffs her ether damage by 8%, and her ult and EX specials ether sheer damage by 10%. Now, this Wenjin does not only make balancing her crit ratios easier while giving her tons of sheer force with its HP buff, it also gives her a 16% ether damage buff and a 20% ether sheer damage buff for her ult and EX special, which translates to a 36% damage buff for Yixuan, which is insane since she'll pretty much have a full uptime on this buff. Now, its best alternative right now would be the BP's new Radio Wave journey. Not only does it give 25% bonus HP with its main stat, it also buffs her sheer force by 80 to 128 for 12 seconds every time she uses a chain attack or ult. Now, this stacks up to 3 times, with each stack having an independent duration, with its ability alone giving up to 240 to 384 sheer force depending on the refinement level. It's essentially a huge sheer force stat stick that has pretty good uptime on at least 1 to 2 stacks of its buff due to Yixuan using her ult pretty often. Its only downside is that it's paid and it takes a while to get copies of. Now, her best free-to-play option is the Puzzle Sphere. It gives 25% attack with its main stat and buffs her crit damage by a whopping 25.6% every time she uses an EX special. And if you target an enemy with below 50% HP, her EX special does 50% more damage to it. Sadly, it gives attack instead of HP, so Yixuan does end up getting less sheer force from it. But its huge EX special and crit damage buff is more than enough to make up for it, plus it's easy to get to R5. Though it kinda falls off in Deadly Assault, since in most cases, you'll never get the boss below 50% HP. But it's still good for general use. But with possible Wenjins out of the way, let's talk about drive discs. For the 4-piece set, her best set is the new Yingqi Tails set. It gives her 10% bonus HP, and whenever she uses an EX special, ult, or chain attack, it increases her crit rate by 4%, stacking up to 3 times for 15 seconds. This gives a total of 12% crit rate with a refreshable duration, meaning it will have full uptime. And if you have all 3 stacks active, it buffs her sheer force damage by 10%. Now, the set is pretty much made for her. Its HP bonus gives her lots of sheer force, while making it easier to balance her crit ratios, all on top of buffing her sheer damage massively. Its only downside is that it's new, so you have to farm from scratch. But a good temporary option if you want to use her in day 1 is Woodpecker Electro, with Yixuan of course benefiting a lot from its 8% bonus crit rate and up to 27% attack buff. And as an on-fielder, she tends to use basic attacks, dodge counters, and DX specials a lot, so you can pretty much keep good uptime on his full attack buff outside of stuns. Now, if you're wondering if Chaotic Metal works for her since it does buff ether damage and crit damage by a lot, well, it's kinda clunky at best cause Yixuan's anomaly application is kinda bad, especially against bosses, meaning it has a pretty bad uptime. And cause Yixuan has a unique anomaly meter, Aster Yao's off-field attacks won't be able to help with his uptime. So if you want to use this set, you'll have to run Vivian with Yixuan. So honestly, it's better to just use it as a 2-piece set. But speaking of which, for the 2-piece set, you can use Woodpecker for its bonus crit rate if you're not using it for the 4-piece. But aside from this, 2-piece ether damage and 2-piece crit damage can work for good damage. 2-piece attack can work too, but it gives much less beneficial stats than the 3 I just mentioned. So only use it if it has way better substats than the others. But with their possible drive discs out of the way, let's talk about stats. For main stats, you want crit stats for slot 4, ether or HP for slot 5, and HP for slot 6. Fairly simple, but for the slot 5 main stat, ether is generally the best option to go for. but HP can become viable if you happen to have way better substats on it. Just note, since she does ignore defense, pen ratio, and by extension, Rina and flat pen substats are useless on her. So make sure to avoid using a pen ratio slot 5 main stat. As for substats, you mainly want to focus on crit rate or crit damage first, then HP percent, then attack percent, and finally flat HP or attack. But like I said earlier, thanks to her core passive's HP to sheer force conversion, try to get as much HP as you can while keeping a good crit rate ratio. I recommend around 15 to 20k HP as a good goal, but again, you can always get more than this. But if you're wondering, why focus on HP instead of attack? Since Rupture agents are able to convert 30% of their attack into sheer force, while Yixuan's HP conversion only converts 10% of her total HP. Well, it's simple. It's so much easier to get lots of HP compared to attack, meaning HP gives way more sheer force. For example, getting 3000 attack, which is pretty high by the way, only gives her 900 sheer force. Whereas getting 10k HP, which is considered to be very low for Yixuan, ends up giving her 1000 sheer force. So judging by that, she definitely scales better on HP. And it's also worth noting, she can get a lot of crit rate outside of substats. So depending on your setup, you can prioritize the stat less, especially if you have her signature. With her stats out of the way, let's talk about possible teammates. But before we cook up some teams, just note, you need at least one of the characters shown in screen to activate their additional ability. And as usual, just pick a Bangbu that would suit the party. One of her best teammates right now is Jack Black, the Kung Fu Panda. He provides the biggest sheer force buff to Yixuan since he's the only unit that can buff the stat directly, with him giving up to 540 sheer force, which increases to 720 if you have his M6. And aside from this, he also increases the damage the enemy takes by 20% for 10 seconds every time his EX special hits an enemy. And if you happen to get his E1, his damage vulnerability increases to 30%. This of course is all on top of his ult's healing. So TLDR, not only does he provide a massive damage increase for Yixuan, he also provides a bit of survivability, which is neat. Now, despite Yixuan scaling better on HP, attack buffers like Astra Yao, Caesar, or Lucy are pretty good teammates since they can give her a bit of sheer force as well. Now sadly, they give less sheer force than Pan Yinhu, but their supportive utility is more than enough to make up for it, with Astra Yao's quick assist mechanic, chain attack triggers, and damage and crit damage buffs making her, in my opinion, at least on par, if not better than Pan Yinhu as a support, while Caesar as usual brings comforts with her shield and provides a huge damage vulnerability debuff, which is all on top of her acting as a pseudo stunner. And sadly, Lucy is just the budget option if you don't have the two. She provides significantly less sheer force without any other supportive utilities to make up for it. So just use her if you don't have the two. Now you can form a double support team with any of the units I just mentioned, with the best variation being Yixuan, Pan Yinhu, and Astra Yao. But any of these teams should be able to clear any content in the game, being able to achieve good scores in Deadly Assault and fast runs in Sheer Defense. Stunners are also very good teammates to run with her. But with that being said, the best stunner to run with her would be the Tiger Yufufu. Not only does she provide a huge 50% crit damage boost and a decibel refund for whenever her teammates ult, she also does off-field stunning, meaning she gives more field time for Yixuan to deal damage. But sadly, she isn't out yet in the CE server, so I'll refrain from talking too much about her. Koleda and Pulchra are also pretty decent to run with her since their core passive's conditions were updated to include Rupture agents, with Pulchra's off-field stunning and Koleda's extremely fast stunning capabilities giving more field time for Yixuan. Out of the two, however, I recommend Pulchra over Koleda since again, she is an off-field stunner, and if you have her M6, she also provides a pretty good damage buff. With that being said though, you can run any of these stunner teams with any of the supports I mentioned for a standard hyper carry team that allows Yixuan to take advantage of more stuns for huge damage, with the best variation of this team being Yixuan with Yufufu and either Pan Yinhu or Astra Yao. And just like the double support team, these comps can clear any content in the game and achieve good scores in Deadly Assault and fast runs in Shield Defense. Now what about Anbi, Qingyi, or Trigger? Well, sadly, their core passive's conditions weren't updated, so no Yixuan teams can activate them. In Qingyi's case, she deals 20% less daze, meaning she needs even more field time, so she'll end up competing with Yixuan. Now, you can still use them together, but you'll have to play in a more quick swappy playstyle, which can be a bit awkward and uncomfortable without Astra Yao. So I recommend running those three together if you really wanna run Yixuan with Qing Yi. But even my skill issue ridden ass actually got a pretty good score with this team, so it can definitely work. As for Anbi, losing her additional ability isn't too big of a deal, so you can still use her with Yixuan and hyper carry teams if you have no other stunner. But just note, she does need a lot of field time to stun the enemy, so this combo will feel uncomfortable at times as well. So just like Qing Yi, I recommend running Astra Yao if you really wanna run them together. And for Trigger, well, it's actually pretty surprising. Even without her core passive and her signature's defense shred being useless on Yixuan, she was still able to deal good damage while providing quite a bit of stuns to help the team achieve a very high score and deadly assault. But this was so surprising to me that I ended up picking this team as one of the two teams I showcased at the end of the video. But my only recommendation is that you use fossilized core with Trigger, since it does end up giving more days than her signature without her additional ability. And surprisingly, you can run her pretty well with Vivian. This is due to Yixuan being able to spam so much EX specials that it triggers a surprising amount of blooms. And if you decide to run Astra Yao too, the amount of blooms increases to the point that it makes it seem like you're running an anomaly team. And the neat thing is, since Vivian is an off-field sub-DPS, she also gives Yixuan plenty of field time for her rotations to deal damage and build her meters. Now, despite Bloom's damage being lower than if you ran Vivian in anomaly teams, the team was still able to perform generally well. But finally, here's a chart comparing the performance of every Yixuan team I tried in Deadly Assault. Keep in mind, every S-rank agent is at M0 and every A-rank agent is at M6. And all of them except for Trigger and Astra Yao had their signatures. But with that in mind, the scores you see here are due to many variables like my skill issue, so they are bound to change depending on your skill level, team builds, wenjins, and more. But it should still give a good idea on how each of our teams compares to one another. But that's about it because I'm beginning to lose my voice. But there's just one last question. Is she a must-pull? Well, as usual, it depends on your account. She's not really a must-pull if you already have multiple top-tier DPSs like Piabi, Evelyn, and even Hugo, and are satisfied in their performance in clearing content. In this case, it's much better to roll for someone that would benefit your account more or a character you like. And with the other Season 2 characters coming, saving isn't really a bad idea to start preparing for them either. However, Yixuan is definitely a must-pull if you're needing a good DPS. She's a very fun and unique unit that's able to deal lots of damage with her extremely cool-looking combos. So if you're a player who likes stringing together long combos, she might be for you. So you can't really go wrong with pulling for her because she's a fantastic DPS who will definitely be able to carry you through the game's hardest content. And the neat thing is, due to her additional abilities conditions, she can fit in a lot of teams and most likely will get a lot more potential teammates that can support her. But at the end of the day though, if you like Yixuan, pull for her, and if you don't, well don't. Now personally, I'm definitely gonna be pulling for her because I had a ton of fun while testing her out and I really like her design. But make sure to tell me what you think about her in the comments below, and don't forget to hit me with a like and a sub. Now, onto the showcases. Hopefully you enjoy, and please forgive my skill issue, I'm actually terrible at this game.